Hello and welcome to Roundtable. 8 years after Scotland voted to stay part of the United Kingdom, the Scottish National Party wants another stab at gaining independence. The country's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has set October of next year as the date for a vote. But its plans could be blocked by the British government. Sturgeon's threatened legal action to make sure the vote goes ahead. Could this be the end of the 300-year-old union? Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Well, the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union was opposed by a majority of Scots. And for that reason, the Scottish people should be allowed a second referendum, so says the ruling Nationalist Party. However, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has refused to issue what is called a Section 30 order, which gives authority to the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum. To make sure the vote isn't contested, the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, asked the Lord Advocate, the senior Scottish law officer, to refer the question to the UK's Supreme Court. Joining us on this roundtable from Paisley in Scotland, Iain Lawson, former National Executive Member for the Scottish National Party in London, Akash Paun, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government, Special Responsibility for Scotland, and we have with us also John Lloyd, Contributing Editor of the Financial Times and author of Old Acquaintance Be Forgot, The Great Mistake of Scottish Independence. Let's hear, before I go to you, Iain, from Nicola Sturgeon.
The issue of independence cannot be suppressed. It must be resolved democratically. And that must be through a process that is above reproach and commands confidence. That is why I am setting out today the actions the Scottish Government and the Lord Advocate will take in the absence of a Section 30 order to secure Scotland's right to choose. My determination is to secure a process that allows the people of Scotland, whether yes, no or yet to be decided, to express their views in a legal, constitutional referendum so that the majority view can be established fairly and democratic.
So, Iain, I believe you don't think a second referendum will take place in October next year, but if it did and if Scotland voted for independence, what do you think an ideal Scotland would look like to you?
Well, I think a Scotland that holds on to its own resources, that has the ability to decide what the level of tax should be in Scotland, what our priorities are, using the great resources of Scotland. Because if you think about Scotland and you think about our resources, there's very few nations in the world that come even close to the rich energy resources, for instance, that Scotland has. And we're not being able to use them for the benefit of our people at the moment. And that's why the demand is for independence. To be fair to Nicola Sturgeon, I think she's been pushed into this because people were running out of patience with her, doing nothing other than waiting for a Section 30. And the demand for independence, particularly given the cost of living increases, given the fact that we're getting these huge energy bills, in a country that's the most energy rich in the Western world, it's very frustrating for us.
Okay, first question. Fossil fuels are being phased out. That's what Scotland's rich in. That doesn't sound like it's a long-term prospect.
Well, I mean, Scotland doesn't use fossil fuels. We're getting these increases because you're right, fossil fuel prices are soaring. But we in Scotland are very, very rich in renewable sources, and we are paying more to put it into the grid, and we're having to pay exorbitant amounts, for the energy we're giving away free to the United Kingdom, effectively. We're having to pay exorbitant prices to get it back. It's unacceptable.
Okay, John, let me come to you. The mistake of Scottish independence. What Iain's setting out there, to him, sounds like a land of milk and honey and haggis. Is it doable?
Independence is certainly doable. It's a very bad idea, though. I also agree with Iain that I don't think the referendum is going to take place. He's wrong about the energy. It's not the only country with large amounts of renewable energy it can call on. The Scandinavian countries have all got the same. Also, Scotland does indeed use fossil fuels for its energy at the moment. Were it to get the oil, which is now at a high price, and there's probably more if it was prospected for in the Atlantic, then it would be again oil rich. But as you said earlier, oil is now being phased out, and the UK and presumably Scotland, if it were independent, would continue to wish to phase it out. So it's in a rather bad position. It'd be in a terrible position if it was independent. And in the short, medium, possibly even the long term, it would have to pronounce an extraordinary regime of austerity of the kind that it often blames, the SNP blames Westminster for, in order simply to survive. So Scotland, in the short term, medium term, would be a much poorer country. So that's one thing. Secondly, it would be a bad idea politically. Scotland is part of the UK. It has been so for over 300 years. The peoples of the United Kingdom have to a large extent merged. Their cultures remain separate. Scotland certainly does, but they also have the gains of belonging to a much larger group of nations which have come together, as they say, in the last 3 centuries to be a largely successful nation. So to tear it apart, which is what the SNP are in business for and have been for decades, is a very bad idea. And it now seems as though that idea is now failing. And I think, again, I agree with Iain on this. I think the First Minister is not just failing, but flailing around, trying to keep her militants happy by saying that she's going to go for a referendum, which she probably knows is impossible.
Okay, Iain, I see you laughing. I think, ironically, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I'm going to go to Akash first. And Iain, I'm going to be asking you, in The Scotsman, I read today, whose bluff has been called by threats of a wildcat referendum that includes no policies, no particulars, and no visions. So policies, particulars, and visions, that's one thing I'll ask you about. Akash, let me ask you this one. If, as both Iain and John suggest, Nicola Sturgeon has been pushed into this, first of all, by whom? And secondly, why did she agree to it?
I don't know the ins and outs of conversations going on within the SNP, but I think it's clear that there is a wing of the SNP and the nationalist movement that is or has been growing impatient ever since 2016 and the Brexit referendum. Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government have been arguing that Brexit is illegitimate because Scotland didn't vote for it, and Scotland should have the right to vote again on independence and decide on its own constitutional future. But then we've had a sequence of supposedly big moments when different plans have been announced and consultation processes and citizens' assemblies and so on, but there's been no real progress. So in the end, I think Nicola Sturgeon, who obviously wants to be the First Minister of Scotland, who leads Scotland to independence, I think just felt that the time was running out and she had no more options other than to make this move.
In the light of these figures, voters in Scotland, population of about 5.5 million, rejected independence, as we know, in 2014 by 55% to 45%. Now, if another referendum were to be held this month, 51% of Scots would apparently say they would vote no, so they'd stay in the Union, while 49% say they would vote yes. That is according to Savanta Comres. And this was a poll that came out 2 days after Nicola Sturgeon set a date for any new referendum of October of 2023. Look, still no, but the gap's narrowing. Why doesn't she wait just a little bit longer until the demographic changes? We're getting old people dying off. They may be more in favour of remaining in the Union. We're getting more radical young people coming through. Why doesn't she just hold off a little bit longer if that gap is getting smaller and smaller?
Well, it's not clear at all that that's the trend. I mean, sure, yeah, in 2014 it was 55% against independence. In most recent polls, actually, it's been around about 50-50 split, there or thereabouts, and some polls have had yes ahead. Most actually recently have had no ahead, but not very decisively. But it's not clear there's much of a trend in any direction. And I think the future is obviously always going to be uncertain. But I suspect that from a SNP perspective, it's always going to be preferable to making the case for independence when you have a conservative government at Westminster, particularly one led by a prime minister who's obviously on the ropes, very unpopular for all sorts of reasons. It's a much more conducive situation in which to argue the UK is failing, Westminster is corrupt, and Scotland needs to be free of it.
Okay, well, let's ask Iain the same question
that as well.
Iain, why not wait just a little bit longer? The gap's getting narrower.
Well, you know, I'm participating in this programme and wondering if we're in Mars. I mean, in 2014, the yes side started off at 28% and ended up at 45%. Starting off at 50% or 51%, if you take the most recent panel-based poll, which is after the poll that you've quoted, which was in favour of independence, you know, it's a very healthy position to start from that point. The other thing I've got to just say, I mean, this poor country, Scotland, and saddled with all that oil and gas, you know, other countries must feel really sorry for us. You know, Scotland's a rich, rich country, and no amount of propaganda will change that. And if you want to know why there's a referendum, let me tell you why. There's going to be a vote. It won't be a referendum, it'll be a plebiscite election. But it will happen because Westminster broke every single promise they made to the Scottish people in 2014. And that's the great weakness of the Union this time round, because nobody's going to believe anything they say.
Let me put this to you. The Scotsman said no policies, no particulars, no vision. Let's go back and look at what happened to Ireland when it gained its independence in the early 1920s. There was an element of the Anglo-Irish Treaty that the Irish Free State was to assume liability for a fixed share of existing UK debt estimated to have been 80% of Ireland's GDP. There'll be higher levels of public spending in Scotland. That's been promised. There'll be lower tax revenues, possibly because of what we said. There'll be a massive budget deficit. You can't make up for all of that simply by saying we've got more oil and gas in the North Sea.
It's not just more oil and gas, and it's an insult to Scotland to even suggest that. We export more per head than any other part of the UK. We are the only part of the UK that is a surplus of trade. We've got a positive trade balance. The rest of the UK doesn't. So, you know, we're not really, I mean, all I'm going to say to you is, if you really believe this, then down south you should be delighted to get rid of us, because we must be a terrible anchor. But that's not what Rab said in Westminster last week. He was very clear. He said they needed to be better together because Scotland's got all the resources. His words, not mine.
Okay, let me come to you, John. We've got this suggestion of higher levels of public spending, lower tax revenues, and other people have likened it to what's happened in Spain with Catalonia, the Catalan protests, arrests, political crackdown, searches, civil disobedience. These are just some things that I've noted down from various articles. Prosecutions, sentencing of civilian leaders. In other words, a little bit of civil unrest. Is that possible? Because what we've seen is a country that's divided after Britain voted to leave the European Union, and antagonism still there. This would be, in its own way, the breakup of a family rather than the breakup of distant relatives.
Scotland is not Ireland. It's got no history of real civil disobedience, violence, internal violence. So I doubt there would be, again, there would be some. I mean, there is some unpleasantness. There was some unpleasantness around the referendum in 2014, both before, during, and after. But it was relatively minor. And I doubt it would be again. I think what would happen after a, let's say a successful referendum, successful in the SNP's terms, that is, a vote which would be marginal. It might be 51, 52%, rather like Brexit itself. If that happened, then the division in Scotland, which already exists, would be very, very stark. And especially on the business side, I think the flight from Scotland, which already has been noticeable, many of the big corporations are now headquartered, the banks, especially the finance companies, are now headquartered in Scotland, in London rather, before they were headed in Scotland. And so Scotland would then be faced with a whole series of blows to its economy, both its financial economy and its real economy, which no amount of saying that it possesses vast amounts of energy, both gas and oil and natural energy, could compensate for. It would be, and this is true of every economist, including those who have been rather pro-independence, but every economist of any worth has said that for at least a decade, Scotland would be poorer, would have to draw in its belt tighter than the rest of the UK and very much the rest of Europe.
Fair enough, John. I'm going to stop you there just because I want to go round the table once again. Iain, I saw you shaking your head again, ironically, particularly about the idea of Scots leaving Scotland to head south. But Akash, it's your turn. Can I ask you a couple of longer-term questions? Would Scotland want to rejoin the European Union? If so, would it have to go to the back of the queue like new countries?
Okay.
The SNP position has been that yes, independent Scotland would seek to rejoin the EU. That was pretty much a clear position, I think, after 2016. I think there's been some signs that maybe now there's a little bit more doubt about what the position actually would be, because the reality is that if an independent Scotland were to rejoin the EU, they would therefore rejoin the single market, they would rejoin the customs union, they would therefore face the prospect of a hard economic border essentially between Scotland and England, or England and Wales, shall we say, which would remain Scotland's main trading partner, probably, maybe permanently, but certainly for the short, medium term. And that would be a very difficult position, I think, for Scotland and Scottish business to be in. So there's therefore been talk about whether Scotland could secure for itself some kind of special status equivalent to the Northern Ireland Protocol that would give it access both to the British and the European market.
Which has not been without.
I think that would be very difficult to negotiate Northern Ireland.
But that has not been without its problems as well, has it not? So, and pegged to sterling.
Yeah, and Northern Ireland was treated different for very specific reasons about maintaining the stability of power sharing.
So until you,
I think it would be a very difficult choice.
Until you rejoin the European Union, if you want to, your currency would not be the euro. It would have to be pound sterling. Therefore, you would remain, would they, pegged to sterling, no matter what happened to the British pound? The Scottish pound would go up and down as well?
Well, presumably. I mean, in 2014, the Scottish government proposal was that an independent Scotland would seek a formal currency union with the remainder of the UK. So, yeah, they would continue to use the pound. The UK government made clear it had no interest in that model. So subsequently, the Scottish government, or the SNP position, as far as I understand it, is that for an interim period, but I think an interim period that might be quite long, Scotland would simply continue to use the pound as its currency in the way that, say, Panama uses the dollar or some Kosovo uses the euro, but without having any control over monetary policy, which is an approach that also has its critiques.
Shall we bring Iain back in, because he looks like he wants to respond to almost every other sentence. We've got to be fair to you, Iain. And by the way, I love Scotland. My mother was Scottish. I holidayed in Hopeman. I camped in Glenafric. I swam in the sea pool at Stonehaven. Love the country. Love the people. Love the food. Your turn to speak. What do you want to say?
Well, I'm glad this is an international programme, because across the world, in the 64 other nations that have left Westminster over the years, they all have heard all these arguments before. They've been told they'd be too poor, they were too small, too big. If you go back far enough, this is the message exactly that Westminster was preaching to the Americans. And they seem to have done not too badly once they got free. You know, as to the currency, I'm afraid your fellow contributor here is not up to date. The SNP conference voted for its own Scottish currency, pegged to other currencies. Now, the likelihood, I think, would be that a Scottish currency would be pegged to 3 different basket of currencies. The British pound, obviously, because you're quite correct, England will always be a big market for Scotland, and vice versa, by the way. We actually buy more than we sell to England, so we've got a positive trade balance there. Secondly, oil obviously sold in dollars, so it makes sense to tie to the dollar. And the third currency would be the euro, because Scotland's an exporting nation. And it makes sense for us to have all these bases covered.
A quickie before I go to John. I want to ask you, you don't think a referendum's going to happen next year, therefore this is gesture politics. Is it gesture politics simply to keep the SNP up there in terms of popularity and keep politicians in their jobs?
Oh, it'd be a big mistake to think it's anything other than very real. I don't think there'll be a referendum, but I'm certain there'll be a plebiscite election at the next Westminster general election. This isn't going away. And no amount of praying, hoping, putting your heads in the sand down south. This is going to happen. It'll just not be in the form of a referendum. And
Akash,
the reason for that,
I will come to you if I've got a bit of time, but I want to play in Boris Johnson here talking about why he wants the union to stay together.
Don't forget that the long-standing position is that we don't think this is the right time to be doing constitutional change. We're focused on the priorities, which is tackling cost of living, the pressures that we all face, sorting out our economy, our plan for a stronger economy. And I would just say, repeat, I think our economy is all the stronger for being together.
So a quick thought from you, Akash, and then John, I'm coming to you because it looked like you were shaking your head in derision, but Akash.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say that at no point during the discussion have I said that I think Scotland is too poor or incapable for any other reason of being an independent nation. If at some point, through a suitable process, it chooses to do so, I think Scotland should absolutely have the right to take that path. All I've done is, I think, laid out.
Okay, so you're trying to correct the mistake, but do you want to add to the debate?
Well, I was correcting what I think was stated by the previous contributor about views down south. I mean, what I would add to the debate, if I may, is that Scotland is a comparatively wealthy country. But as John Lloyd has previously said, I mean, the current position is factually clear that there is a fiscal transfer from England to Scotland overall, and the level of public spending in Scotland is substantially higher than in England. And that's not because Scottish tax revenue is higher than tax revenue. It's because there's a transfer from England. So in the situation,
so Westminster's paying for Scotland to some extent. You are saying
to some extent,
Iain, you're saying it really doesn't go that way. Let me come to you. Let me come to you, John Lloyd. John Lloyd, if I may, to sort of help wrap this all up. Your book, The Great Mistake of Scottish Independence. I'm sure it's more than 30 seconds long if you read it out loud, but tell us what the great mistake is.
Well, I think I said it earlier. The great mistake is to break up a relatively successful country, to plunge people into comparative, not absolute, of course, comparative poverty for indeterminate length of time, and to use as one of the major weapons of that. And I mean, Iain has shown at least a trace of that in the last half hour, to use as one of the major weapons of that, a denigration of the neighbour England, which has been our partner Scotland's partner for more than 300 years, and even before that, to erect a kind of whited sepulchre of Anglican domination over a country which has been in receipt and still is in receipt of a large subsidy, largely from the UK, actually, largely from the southeast part of England, and then to argue that Scotland actually is richer than the rest of the UK, exports more than the rest of the UK. 60% of Scotland's export goes to the UK and would be in some doubt.
OK, listen, we didn't even get round to defence. There are so many issues that we will cover in the next 12 months. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Iain. Thanks, Akash. John, good to see you on the programme again. Thank you, wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable. We will be back. I'm David Foster. Thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.